Forensic scientists say the bodies are victims of the 1995 Srebrenica massacre, in which 8,000 Muslims were killed by Bosnian Serb soldiers. Another 4 mass graves have already been found in the area.
Anniversary, but we ain't here to celebrate. We here to mourn, put your fist up and demonstrate. 11/7/95 be the date, premeditated genocide. My people in mass graves, 8,000 male individuals killed in cold blood, the evil, despicable. The world watch television with the visual, equally feeble. Now hide these war criminals, a blood ritual, feeling so nauseous. Visions of my people killed by Serb forces. No remorses, we ache for our losses. Fathers, sons, mothers and daughters. United Nations, guilty as the culprits. Let guns and rockets murder our kids. They ain't peacekeepers, they're more like bigots. Now close your eyes, can you picture all the victims? Can anybody hear the cry from the grave? The pain and the fear that was felt by the slain. Can anybody hear the cry from the grave? From the people that died in the brutal campaign? Fist up! Never again will we kneel. If Bosnia cries, we'll be there on the battlefield, ready to die for our land to be shielded. And never again will they destroy what we build. How can we forgive and how can we forget? We can never consider it until justice we get. This was mass murder and orchestrated death. Old Bosnian women now living with nothing left. Take a deep breath and imagine the misery. Hundreds of women being raped repeatedly. Mentally no escape from this kind of scenery. The blue helmet stood by, no sympathy. Blame it on religion. Say religion's hate, but the people who did this must have had no faith. Invade a small village, killing will not evade. Blood spilling on their guns, will God forget their ways? 10,000 kids left with no parents, murdered by the many paramilitary agents in just one city with no form of defense. And these are words from a person that was ethnically cleansed. Can anybody hear the cry from the grave? The pain and the fear that was felt by the slain. Can anybody hear the cry from the grave? From the people that died in the brutal campaign? Fist up! Never again will we kneel. If Bosnia cries, we'll be there on the battlefield, ready to die for our land to be shielded. And never again will they destroy what we build.
Zar si zaboravio silovane majke muslimanke? Zar si zaboravio ubijenu djecu? Zar si zaboravio?
Can anybody hear the cry from the grave? The pain and the fear that was felt by the slain. Can anybody hear the cry from the grave? From the people that died in the brutal campaign? Fist up! Never again will we kneel. If Bosnia cries, we'll be there on the battlefield, ready to die for our land to be shielded. And never again will they destroy what we build. Can anybody hear the cry from the grave? The pain and the fear that was felt by the slain. Can anybody hear the cry from the grave? From the people that died in the brutal campaign? Fist up! Never again will we kneel. If Bosnia cries, we'll be there on the battlefield, ready to die for our land to be shielded. And never again will they destroy what we build.
In one of my earlier videos, not part of this series, I mentioned a Christchurch businessman who made comments on Facebook threatening to destroy mosque after mosque until I'm taken out. I compared those comments to Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, an event where synagogues across Germany and Austria were destroyed in a prelude to the Holocaust. I think it's valid to make that comparison, and the chair of the New Zealand Holocaust Foundation would appear to agree. As she noted in a statement on those comments, both the Holocaust and the Christchurch shooting did not begin with acts, but with words that went unchallenged. Why did I reach back over 70 years for a historical comparison, rather than comparing those comments to the destruction of 1,400 mosques in Bosnia, an event that happened in my lifetime, targeting the same minority group who were targeted in Christchurch? The reason is that at that time it wasn't a historical event I was aware of. In this, the final part of this series, we're going to look at how and why the events of Bosnia in the 1990s haven't been etched into our collective memory. Louis Gentile opened his letter to the New York Times that was referenced in part 2 with the words, "I wonder how many of your readers have seen Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List." Most of us, even if we've never formally studied history, are aware of the atrocities committed by the Nazis against the Jews and other minority groups in the Holocaust. That said, there is evidence that our collective memory of the Holocaust is failing, and there are efforts to keep those memories alive as the last of the survivors reached the end of their lives. Many survivors of the Bosnian Genocide are younger than I am, and we have ample contemporary news stories, footage, and the findings of the long trials of many of the perpetrators. Why are we not remembering?
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices, secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror.
The terror attacks in the United States in 2001 are another event that we should never forget, and there is much in place to assure we won't. Even in my hometown, over 14,000 kilometres from New York City, we have a memorial made of steel from the World Trade Center building. I was 14 years old when those attacks happened. Jump forward a few months and I'm still 14 years old, and I'm at my local cinema watching Black Hawk Down, Ridley Scott's film about the US military's attempt to capture Mohammed Farah Aidid, leader of the Somali National Alliance, one of the factions in the civil war that was taking place in the early 1990s. I found the film kind of dull. If I were to watch an American war movie from that era today, I'd much prefer David O. Russell's Three Kings. One person who was a fan, though, was US President George W. Bush. Bush organised the screening of the movie at the White House and told his aides that America's hasty withdrawal from Somalia after 18 Americans died in the 1993 raid depicted in the film had emboldened America's terrorist enemies and led to the terror attacks on September 11th. Bush later held another screening for 20 members of Congress. The historian and cultural critic Richard Slotkin wrote that with this film Ridley Scott had defined the terms of a new kind of war against Islamic terrorism, and compared his depiction of the Somali Muslims to the monsters and aliens. I know, and Slotkin knows, that while Scott directed the first Alien film, he didn't direct the second one, but I think this is a good point regardless.
The movie also dehumanizes the enemy by visually associating them with the monsters and aliens. The Somalis in Black Hawk Down swarm in masses through the narrow streets and alleys, just as the monsters swarm through the tunnels of the space colony and aliens. In both films, the enemy's final attack on the American defenses is first detected by the swarming of blips on a radar screen. So when the moment of berserk killing comes, the Sergeant Dane moment, the audience accepts the firestorm as an appropriate response to the masked monsters.
It wasn't just Black Hawk Down that shaped perceptions of Muslims in the West. Think of TV shows like 24 and Homeland, both of which drew criticism for the way they depicted Muslims. Howard Gordon, who was showrunner on both series, was asked by Hamid Al-Aziz of Mother Jones if he had any regrets about 24, and this is what he replied.
I actually do have regrets about one particular moment, which had more to do with the promotion of the show. In Season 2, the story involved a Muslim American family, and the father and the mother, and the son, were party to a terror plot. It was sort of a purple conceit in a way. But it was maybe a year and a half after 9/11, and on the 405 freeway, there's this giant electronic billboard, and I think the line was, "They could be next door." The writers and the producers were not party to that campaign, but we quickly put an end to it, and realized how dangerous and potentially incendiary this show could be.
In the same way Vaktrukovich's novel Noz had propagated hatred against Muslims in Serbia, Western popular culture was othering Muslims and depicting them as terrorists, influencing the way that non-Muslims thought about them. And it wasn't just TV and movies. Just as Serbian intellectuals had been spreading an anti-Islam ideology in the lead-up to the Bosnian Genocide, a certain subset of West European and North American thinkers had taken to spreading Islamophobia. In 2011, the French writer Renaud Camus published Le Grand Replacement. Its English title, The Great Replacement, as shared by the Christchurch Shooters Manifesto. Camus claims that an elite is colluding against white Europeans, wanting to replace them with non-white, specifically Muslim people. Echoing the view of Miroslav in the 1980s, Camus claims this is happening in part through the higher birth rates of Muslim populations, something he calls genocide by substitution. Sam Harris, the American neuroscientist who had become a prominent figure in New Atheism, pivoted from criticising Christianity, the dominant religion in the United States and adhered to by its political leaders, to criticising Islam, the religion adhered to by the majority of people in the countries America was at war with, as well as a minority population within the US. In 2013, he stated that the people who speak most sensibly about the threat Islam poses to Europe are actually fascists. In 2014, the Canadian conservative columnist and best-selling author Mark Steyn published Lights Out, Islam, Free Speech in the Twilight of the West, which claimed Muslims have no investment in the Western societies they live in, and that Muslims in Europe were abusing welfare programs and having more children than the native population. Heinz Christian Strache, the Austrian politician who led the far-right Freedom Party from 2005 to 2019, has not only claimed that Islam poses an existential threat to Europe, he's promoted the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, and was a strong advocate of the Serbian nationalist cause, opposing Austria's recognition of Kosovo's independence and stating that a multi-ethnic Bosnia and Herzegovina can't function, and that the Republika Srpska, that is, the territories ethnically cleansed of Muslims, should break away from the country. Strache was serving as Austria's Vice-Chancellor at the time the Christchurch shooting happened. There's a part in Michael Sell's book, Bridge Betrayed, Religion and Genocide in Bosnia, where he asks his American readers to consider the Oklahoma City bombing, comparing the similar background to the events in the lead-up to the Bosnian Genocide.
Allegations were made that an ethno-religious group was plotting and carrying out genocide, militias were arming to battle the federal government, which was allegedly supporting the genocidal plot, a battle was looming to save Christian values and identity, a violent text read and memorized by militia members recounted the plot against Christians, the battle to save Christendom, and the punishment in store for race traitors. Bombings, shootings, and other terrorist acts carried out by such militias were on the increase.
Sells asks his readers to imagine that such extremists had control over major US media, as has been the case in the former Yugoslavia. Sell's book was published in 1998, so he couldn't foresee the changes in media landscape that would come about with social media in the 2010s. The Royal Commission report into the Christchurch shooting notes the impact that YouTube has had on political extremism.
In the past, YouTube has been often associated with far-right content and radicalization. There has been much debate about the way YouTube's recommendation system works. One theory is that the system drove users to ever more extreme material into what is sometimes said to be a rabbit hole. An alternative theory is that the way in which YouTube operates, facilitates, and has monetized the production of videos that attract viewers and the widespread availability of videos supporting far-right ideas reflects the demand for such videos. What is clear, however, is that videos supporting far-right ideas have been very common on YouTube.
In 2016, an internal report at Facebook noted that 64% of users who joined extremist groups on the platform did so because Facebook's algorithm recommended those groups to them. The Royal Commission report notes the shooters' involvement in Facebook groups ran by the Australian far-right group The Lads Society.
He was an active contributor, posting on topics related to issues occurring in Europe, New Zealand in his own life, far-right memes, media articles, YouTube links, many of which have since been removed for breaching YouTube's content agreements, and posts about people who were either for or against his views.
The shooter had donated to Rebel Media, the far-right media outlet that employed Lawrence Southern, and to Stefan Molyneux's Free Domain Radio. Southern and Molyneux had come to New Zealand the year before the shooting, but were unable to find a venue willing to host them. As they departed, Southern's final message to the country was, "Hope you enjoy Sharia." Neither of those people would have been able to gain an audience willing to pay to see them speak in a far-flung corner of the world, if not for the platform that had been given to them by social media.
To me, all this hate and violence is being facilitated by a handful of internet companies that amount to the greatest propaganda machine in history. The greatest propaganda machine in history. Let's think about it. Facebook, YouTube, and Google, Twitter, and others, they reach billions of people. The algorithms these platforms depend on deliberately amplify the type of content that keeps users engaged. Stories that appeal to our baser instincts and that trigger outrage and fear. It's why YouTube recommended videos by the conspiracist Alex Jones billions of times. It's why fake news outperforms real news, because studies show that lies spread faster than truth.
YouTube has banned Southern and Molyneux from their platform, as well as other prominent far-right and conspiracist content creators. And Facebook's algorithms no longer recommend political groups to its users. But look what it took. The death of a counter-protester at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, the massacres in Christchurch and El Paso, the insurrection in the US Capitol in which 5 people lost their lives. It took this violence and death for these platforms to act, as if we've forgotten where this rhetoric leads.
This is not about limiting anyone's free speech. This is about giving people, including some of the most reprehensible people on earth, the biggest platform in history to reach 1/3 of the planet. Freedom of speech is not freedom of reach. Sadly, there will always be racists, misogynists, anti-Semites, and child abusers. But I think we can all agree that we should not be giving bigots and pedophiles a free platform to amplify their views and target their victims.
These private social media corporations have never been committed to free speech. Banning hateful rhetoric is no more an infringement on free expression than the long-standing policy of both Facebook and YouTube to not allow nudity. There's an argument that as private companies, they have no obligation to protect free speech. It's technically correct, but also not the argument I would use. It's at least in part that these companies are profit-driven that it's taken them so long to do something about bigotry on their platforms. For a long time, that bigotry was making them money, and the human cost was just an externality. That's an opinion shared by the workers at Alphabet, YouTube's parent company, who recently organised into a union. They released a statement following the storming of the US Capitol in January 2021.
We know that social media has emboldened the fascist movement growing in the United States, and we are particularly cognizant that YouTube, an Alphabet product, has played a key role in this growing threat, which has received an insufficient response by YouTube executives. Workers at Alphabet have previously organised against the company's continued refusal to take meaningful action to remove hate, harassment, discrimination, and radicalisation from YouTube and other Alphabet-operated platforms to no avail. YouTube must no longer be a tool of fascist recruitment and oppression. Anything less is to countenance deadly violence from Gamergate to Charlottesville, from Christchurch to Washington DC, from Jair Bolsonaro to Donald Trump.
Over the past few years, we've seen what can happen when we forget history. I'm going to end this series with a pledge to do something that'll help the world remember. All the money I receive on Patreon for May, June and July 2021 will be donated to the UK-based organisation Remembering Srebrenica to help open the world's first International Srebrenica Memorial Learning Centre. A link to my Patreon is in the description of this video, and there's also a link to Remembering Srebrenica if you prefer to donate to them directly. Together, let's make sure the world never forgets.